I want to make a quick video going over the Frost Mage changes, and I want to start with the issues. I will go over each of the changes individually, but I feel like the issues is a lot more important to have at the start of the video. I did make a forum post about it, which people seem to like, so I'll link that down below if you want to read it. It's kind of going to cover a lot of what I'm going to talk about in the video. But all right, the main problem is that they didn't fix the uptime downtime issue that Frost has right now, because right now you're heavily punished if you have downtime during Icy Veins, because you can't get CDR on Icy Veins and you can't upkeep Icy Veins, so it just falls off and then you have a bunch of time where you don't have Icy Veins. They tried to fix this a little bit because they removed Icy Propulsion. However, your uptime is looking to be a lot more important than it has been before, because they added so much power into Icy Veins and kept Thermal Void. So now, in addition to the 30% haste you get from Icy Veins, you have a Water Elemental, which does, a decent amount of damage, which gives you a 20% frost damage buff, and which also generates Brain Freeze for you every 15 seconds with Water Jet. So this makes Icy Veins ridiculously important to upkeep compared to how it was before. And so if you ever spend a period of time not hitting mobs when you're in Icy Veins and your Icy Veins falls off when it could be extended, you're losing a massive amount of value, because not only are you losing the 30% haste, you're also losing the 20% damage and Water Elemental, which comes with all its perks. So they need to remove Thermal Void. And I'm fine with Icy Propulsion being removed. Kind of prefer it, actually. But they also need to reduce Icy Veins CD. And I mean, this has been a long time coming. It's not really a 3-minute cooldown, and 3-minute cooldowns feel really, really bad in Mythic Plus. They feel pretty bad kind of everywhere, actually. And so they've laid the groundwork for it already, because they've done this critical mass idea of getting increased haste kind of passively and getting more haste stat from all sources, which I love. I just really wish they just remove haste from Icy Veins. It always feels bad just going from 30% haste to not having it, especially on such a long duration cooldown as Icy Veins is. So just removing the haste from it and baking a lot more of it into this passive talent, say like 10% increased haste, and then that's fine. So you're retaining a pretty decent haste increase, and you can just get a lot more from your gear as well. It's not too crazy, would be great. And then removing Thermal Void, so we don't have this issue of needing to hit the boss for 50 seconds to maintain your Water Elemental, would be great. So you have a shorter cooldown, powerful kind of burst tool that's thematic in Water Elemental. That's not, going to get you completely screwed if you have to take a mechanic off the boss for, 10 seconds into your Icy Veins. So really hope they go with a flat duration, lower cooldown. Anyway, there's also the issue of ramp. You still have Slick Ice, you still have Chain Reaction. So, if you're just starting out in Icy Veins, or if you reset one, right, that resets your Slick Ice stacks, which kind of needs to be looked at. Now you have to get your Water Elemental, hit it 10 times to do 20% increased damage. You have to cast Frostbolt 10 times to do 20% increased damage, and you have to cast Ice Lance 5 times to do 5% increased damage, which isn't as important. But this feels really bad. Frost is not a ramp spec. It shouldn't be a ramp spec, and I feel like we're leaning a little bit too into that. If you made Icy Veins just give you 20% damage, that's not OP. I feel like they were trying to make a more interactive cooldown, but they didn't have the time to make one that interacted with your, classes spells, so they just added the Water Elemental ramp, which I don't like, especially because it is a debuff. And if there's one thing about Water Elemental, is his Water Jet or his Water Bolt hits one target. So yeah, this does nothing in AoE, which needs to be fixed, obviously, and probably would be. So anyway, those are my thoughts about Icy Veins. But yeah, Cold Snap, they made a baseline. They give you a talent where it resets the cooldown of Frozen Orb, Comet Storm, Blizzard, and your next chemical applies Winter's Chill to all enemies. This first part seems pretty fitting of a 5-minute cooldown. The only issue is, every time there's a choice in WoW for either damage or defensives, do I need to tell you which one people choose? They choose damage. So this makes Cold Snap not a damage or utilities, button anymore, which I don't like. I think it should remain that utility choice. So my suggestion is actually to fix a pretty hated spell for Frost here with this effect, because I think that they were really onto something with this. And so I would rather they replace Snowstorm. Snowstorm also has the ramping problem where it takes you 45 seconds of casting Blizzard on mobs for you to get the damage buff to Cone of Cold, and then you have to use it, but 45 seconds into a pull, most of the mobs are dead, and it just feels bad, and then your stacks fall off when you're walking to the next pack. So I would really like for them to kind of take Snowstorm and reverse it, and then add a bit of this effect to it. So right now, instead of taking 45 seconds to ramp, just increase Cone of Cold's cooldown when you have Snowstorm talented. And then you can have like a 45-second cooldown Cone of Cold that does 600% increased damage, so same effect as Snowstorm, and it can apply Wear's Chill to all enemies, and it can give you like, you know, a small amount of CDR and Comet Storm. I don't think Frozen Orb and Blizzard need CDR. Maybe you want to do something else besides Comet Storm, but I like the Comet Storm CDR. You're already casting Frozen Orb and Blizzard all the time. I don't think it needs to be casted more, but I really like the whole next Cone of Cold applies Wear's Chill. I would really, really like it for Snowstorm to not be a ramp effect, because this would be a hell of a lot more satisfying if it was simply a long cooldown that you could press when it's up when you wanted it. Cone of Cold doesn't matter as a utility choice anymore. No one takes it for the slow. No one uses it. You have Blizzard for that. You have a bunch of roots. So it doesn't matter. And this is just a much more satisfying version of it. For Glacial Spike, it's kind of dead in the water still. You know, they buffed it by 10%. This is space damage. Doesn't matter at all. This might as well have not happened. And they also made it, you know, extend Thermal Void, or interact with Thermal Void through Icy Veins. This is fine. Decent change, but this is not the main problem with Glacial Spike. The main problem with Glacial Spike stems from Frost Mastery. Frost Mastery is icicles. Anything that generates icicles is the only thing that actually gives you a return on value for your mastery, because Glacial Spike, its damage is comprised of base damage plus your 5 icicles. Whether or not you cast Glacial Spike, those 5 icicles were getting sent anyway. So Glacial Spike does not scale with Mastery at all because it doesn't generate icicles. So the time that you spend casting Glacial Spike, which is its like, 3-second base cast, is entirely devoid of Mastery scaling. And that is the problem with Glacial Spike, is that you have 6,000 Mastery points, and when you're casting Glacial Spike, you are benefiting from 0 of it. The benefit that Glacial Spike has is from being able to force, you know, all 5 of your icicles to crit, which is a lot less of a problem now that we have such a high amount of flurries being spent throughout our rotation, where even in the default rotation, you're getting a 60% shadow rate on your icicles. So Glacial Spike really just has no benefit, which is why it's a 16% DPS loss, and the changes they just did to it are not going to really change that. I mean, they might make it like a 10% DPS loss or something, but the major issue with it and with other active abilities is our current mastery, because they don't generate icicles. Nothing does except for our base rotation. And I'm really hoping that one of the steps that they take is they just change our mastery. We used to have a mastery back in MOP called Frostburn, which just increase your damage onto frozen targets, which sounds like it affects, you know, active abilities a lot more evenly, and it does. You know, it affects Comet Storm, you know, Glacial Spike, Ice Lance, all those things a lot more equally. So it's a lot better. You can keep icicles as a base mechanic, but if they aren't scaling with a stat that is your best stat, then all of a sudden all these active abilities become a lot more possible to take. So it's kind of a change. That's the main anti-synergy within Frost rotation. So it's kind of what they need to fix. Frozen Orb, there's nothing in here about Frozen Orb. There's 2 main issues with it. I'll talk about the movement first. Movement, Frozen Orb obviously keeps moving when you shoot it out, and it stops like immediately if when it hits an enemy, as long as you're further than a minimum range. Really, this needs to be placeable like Cursor, like it is in PvP, so you don't need to stand in melee, and you don't need to stand a specific, you know, range away in melee, because it has a minimum range it has to travel. And it also needs to not keep moving in forward after you place it. It needs to just, you know, track with the enemies like Ravager does, because right now it has too small of a radius and it's way too easy for tanks to move out of it, especially considering the fact that it keeps moving after you place it. And then the Freezing Winds bug, I kind of describe it here, but basically your Freezing Winds buff is applied when you cast Orb, and it's changed by orbs spawning or despawning. So if you have multiple orbs out, the reason you lose Freezing Winds is because the first orb despawns, and that removes the Freezing Winds buff until you cast Frozen Orb again. But then your first orb again will despawn and then remove the buff again. So you'll just get in this chain of continually losing the buff when you can't really expect it. And there's not really a reason for this to exist, because it could just be like Freezing Rain, where it gives you a 12-second buff, and then that buff is refreshed when you cast Orb again. So yeah, I really hope they fix that. I also think they should nerf Freezing Winds, which people might find controversial, but you just have you have too many Fingers of Frost in AoE. That's part of the reason why Ice Lance is so weak, is because you're able to cast so many Ice Lances. So nerfing it allows for you to fit in more abilities that you will be fitting in now that they've changed some of these to be pretty strong, without overcapping Fingers of Frost. So that'd be good. Now we'll just kind of going through this, change by change a little bit. Made Blizzard and Cold Snap baseline really good. This is what I was really hoping they would do. It's just a passive version of Critical Mass, but for haste. Ideally, they remove the haste from Icy Veins, because again, it feels really bad to drop from 30% haste to just losing that after Icy Veins drops off. So I prefer Icy Veins was just a damage cooldown, and your haste was just passively increased by more than this all the time. They just nerfed Frostbolt to get rid of minimal Ice Lance, which is certainly a large reason for the problem, but it's not the only reason. A lot of the reason has to do with Flurry's power versus Ice Lance, which you can read this section if you want. I don't really want to go over it, but yeah, Flurry is just a lot better than Ice Lance right now. So Comet Storm, they made it a lot more accessible, increased its damage. They made Glacial Assault synergize with Comet Storm, which means you might take 1 point of this in AoE, which is nice. And they made Splint Ice cause Ebon Bolt and Glacial Spike to deal more damage to the second target, which doesn't really matter, because Glacial Spike's main value, again, is in the fact that you can shatter it against the main target. That's the only benefit it provides. You can't do that against the second target. It'll essentially always hit like a wet noodle on the second target, because you can't force it to shatter. A lot of its damage is forced into crit damage because you have Piercing Cold and Overwhelming Energy. So that's 30% increase to crit damage, which this ability is balanced around. So when it can't guarantee you to crit on the second target, it's pretty much a weak spell. Yeah, this is another Frostbolt nerf. Ebon Bolt, this doesn't really matter. Glacial Spike, that doesn't matter because it's only 10%, it's base damage. This is fine. Slick Ice replace Ice Propulsion. They should delete Ice Propulsion. Would have preferred they kind of nerf Slick Ice too. Thermal Void, we already talked about that. And Ray of Frost, they made this kind of a capstone, reduce its cooldown, and then made it, do 80% more damage throughout your rotation. I think this is good. I do think it's kind of weird that this both, you want to wait for it to have the max damage buff before casting it, but it also has a cooldown. So maybe they should just change this to not have a cooldown, but only be castable at like max stacks. I feel like that would make a lot more sense. Because right now, they reduce the cooldown, but you're just going to hold it until you have max stacks anyway. So not really sure what the point of that is. But yeah. I do like it though. I think that's interesting. Or it would be more interesting if you were casting Ray Frost more often. So basically, if it didn't have a cooldown, this would become a lot more important as a filler, because you'd be doing it a lot more often. In which case, it would be more interesting, because right now it's just a passive buff that you're not going to play around, because you're just going to always have it, because you're going to definitely, Ice Lance 10 times in 60 seconds. So, yeah. We already talked about this. This was something I was in support of. We already talked about it a lot, but Water Elemental, very thematic. Really hope that they just change this effect a little bit and remove Thermal Void, because it lasting 50 seconds is kind of cool, but also super, super punishing. And then they made, Water Elemental Giga Chat, which is nice. They also nerfed the Incanter's Flow. Just remove it. I'd take an extra utility point. You made a lot of utility points better in the general tree, so I like that. Just, remove Incanter's Flow. Doesn't really need to exist. Anyway, thanks for watching. Leave comments, questions down below. I'm going to link this forum post down below. And Norner also made a forum post. He's like the Frost Mage APL guy, so I will also link that down below. There you go. And he's going to say some very smart things. So have a good rest of your day.